All right, this is Taylor Elwood with Indie Author Business Success, and this is actually the first podcast, and I'm really thrilled because I have here Stephanie Connolly with me. Actually, she has a number of aliases, so I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and who you are and what you write.
Okay, it's good to be here, Taylor. Thank you for inviting me. And my name is Stephanie Connolly Reisner. I have 4 different pen names. I write nonfiction, I write steamy romance, I write urban fantasy, horror, mystery under a different pen name, and I write PG-13 fantasy and clean romance under a 4th pen name. So my pen names are S. Conley for the nonfiction, Anne O'Connell for the steamy romance, Audrey Bryce for the horror, urban fantasy, mystery, and S.J. Reisner for all the clean stuff. So yeah, I keep myself pretty busy between the fiction and the nonfiction.
Yeah, I mean that's four different pen names, and so so that's 4 different audiences potentially. I mean, I imagine there's some bleed over for some of those audiences, but at the same time, speaking as somebody who writes for multiple audiences myself, I definitely don't always see that bleed over, and I think it's kind of a it's important to recognize that. So let's talk a little bit about that. Do you see a lot of bleed over between the audiences, or do you find that you have separate distinct audiences depending on what the given subject material is?
Well, one of the reasons I even bothered with the pen names is because of the different audiences.
Hmm.
I do have some that like crossover, and they'll read either anywhere from 2 to all 4 of the pen names. But generally, I find that the nonfiction readers don't want to read fiction, and vice versa. And I've found that the people who read the clean romance don't want to read the steamy romance. And I don't want a young person, because my clean stuff is safe for like age 13 plus. So I don't want a young person to get a hold of some of my steamier work. And there's some people who just like horror and thrillers, and they don't want the romance at all. So they don't want either of the other 2 pen names. So, and they don't want nonfiction either. So yeah, they're very distinctly different audiences. So
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. I think it was kind of eye-opening for me. Like I write for the one audience that I would think would be a fiction audience in some ways, because they, the occult audience, like surely they would like that because a lot of them are geeks and nerds. No, forget that. There are very specific types of geeks and nerds, and it's a good reminder really that any kind of audience, that you can't really make assumptions about them, that you have to recognize. I've gone the opposite route of you. I just use my name with everything. And I mean, well, time will tell and see how well that works out. But it's just the way that I am. I've always used my name, and there you go. But, there's always time to change it down the line, too. I mean, that's kind of the beauty of things, with
right.
being an indie author. So how long have you been on your indie author business journey? I mean, you've been doing this for a while. I mean, as far back as I've known you, and I think I've known you since the late 1990s. I think that's when you had started to delve into self-publishing with the first book that I had from you, which was Modern Demonolatry, which was a limited
Right.
edition book.
Yes. So I basically, we didn't know exactly how we were going to publish it, because this was like the first project I ever did was like in cahoots with some friends. And we had originally meant to make it specifically for our little group. And we ended up going into league with like a friend of mine who was running a publishing company. And she's like, you know what, we'll go ahead and do it. And, we'll just deal with it that way. And it was like, okay, that'll work. We'll do it in like a hardcover. And then she had like a binding machine, and like she did a lot of it in house. Um, so it was just really, it was a bizarre experience, but it wasn't really until 2006 that I discovered Lulu. Like Lulu was one of the first indie publishing things on the scene at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had people calling, like after that first book went out of print, I actually had people calling my house looking for that book. because it was nonfiction, and of course it was, witchcraft, occult, and so people really wanted it. Apparently, it had because we had only printed 100 copies initially. So for years we got copies, and finally my husband was like tired of it. He's like, "Oh my gosh, can you just call these people and tell them it's not in print?" So I started doing some research on the web. I was like, well, maybe I should put it back in print if these people want it so bad, and they're obviously, hunting me down, literally finding my home number.
Yeah, that had to be a little freaky.
It was a little freaky. I was like, how the heck are you people getting my number? But there's lots of public records online nowadays. I mean, people can find you if they really want to. But what I ended up doing was finding Lulu, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to put the book right back in print. So it was trial and error, like learning how to format an interior to where it looked professional. So like my first books did not look professional, and I didn't use professional editors in the very beginning because I couldn't afford them. They're very expensive. As a matter of fact, we're still I'm in the process of doing the first book that I published was Modern Demonolatry, which morphed into the Complete Book of Demonolatry. And the Complete Book of Demonolatry was like I think a 2006 publication. I published that like a year. I think I did Modern Demonolatry again in 2005 with Lulu, and then in 2006 I did the Complete Book of Demonolatry. And again, I didn't have professional editors for that because it was just too expensive. But now we're getting ready to do I think we're going to do like a 25-year edition, probably in 2020. No, there's a 30-year. We're basically revising the whole thing, and I have professional editors working on it now.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, it's interesting how it's come a long way. You know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you make a really interesting point. I think a lot of people who get into the indie author model don't realize the costs that can occur. I mean, you look at it and you're like, okay, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to self-publish it, and the costs aren't just, of course, in money, but it's also in time. Like, for example, I do my own layout and design. Not everyone necessarily does, but that takes a day. Like if I
right.
go through doing just the print and the ebook takes a day of time, and that's fine. In my case, that's cost effective. It saves money, but not everyone wants to put that amount of time away. But then you go into professional editing, and again, in my case, my editor is my wife, so it's not even and she does a really good job. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not hiring somebody at this point in time because it is an extra cost, and I'm trying to get stuff out there.
Right.
But so I totally get it. And then of course you have the book cover, and that's not even including online ads or anything else. So I totally agree with you on that. I mean, that is one of those cases where you kind of have to look at it and say, well, which costs do I focus on? So how did you go about making that decision in the early days? I mean, obviously the professional editing was kind of one thing, but what was your thought process behind that?
Well, my thought process, because I started with nonfiction, which is so much easier to sell than fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And the cover art wasn't as expensive either. I had people who were willing to do covers for me for like $50, So I mean, that was nothing. I was like, okay, well, I'll pay you to do that. You do have to be careful though when you're using someone who's charging you $50 for cover art too, though. I ran into a problem where one of my cover artists had used a sigil. It was the triangle of art from the Goetia. Apparently it had been cleaned up and it belonged to a specific person. It was copywritten, and it ended up being the front cover of my Goetia workbook. Well, the author contacted me and said, hey, that's my sigil. And I was like, what? And because I mean, and this was like 10 years later, like after it had been, or I don't know, it was at least 5 years later, after I had already paid this cover artist, and this cover artist, I wasn't using them anymore. So I didn't even know how to get a hold of them because their email was bouncing. So I was like, well, great. So I ended up talking to the author, paying him for use of his art, apologizing, and changing the cover myself. But stuff like that happens. So you do have to be careful and find someone reputable. But back then, I didn't know who was reputable and who wasn't. It really was a learning curve because everything was so new. I mean, now you have more reputable people working in the field, and you can get recommendations from other authors. Whereas back then, it was still kind of like the wild frontier.
Yeah.
And you didn't know who you could trust to do things if you paid them to do them, and to do it properly. But like, I've been slowly going through in recent years with the fiction, and some of the nonfiction is going to get a facelift too, where new covers are going to be put up, and you know what I'm saying. So they're getting new interiors and all of that, but it's a long process because I have like over 200 pieces in print. I don't want to say books because not everything is book length. Some of them are chapbooks or, you know, mini guides or whatever. But at the same time, like with nonfiction, you don't have to worry so much about packaging. I mean, you do because you want it to sell, but even then, like some of my older crappy covers, those books sell just fine. They probably sell better with better covers. And I have no doubt, like once I start doing the repackaging, they will do a lot better. But people were buying for the content with my nonfiction, and that's where and it's like been raising in popularity as we go. So it was for the long haul, whereas fiction has that initial where it's a spike. People buy it, and then the interest in it starts to wane until the next book comes out. And so you have kind of like this thing going with the fiction, but with nonfiction, it seems like over time that can actually increase in popularity. So they're totally different animals.
No, I totally see that. I mean, I'm having that similar experience, like where with my fiction, it's kind of like, you know, you have that initial spike of popularity and then it kind of goes away. And unless you're continuing to write in that genre, it's harder to get it out there. I mean, I'm looking at redoing the covers for 3 of my fiction books, my superhero one, because like, well, maybe that's part of the problem because they haven't sold as well as I would like. Whereas with the zombie stuff, which I'm going to wrap up here in the next month or so, you know, it's all like, okay, I've got this figured out. The covers look great and it does sell consistently enough to tell me that at least enough people are reading it and wanting it. So that's good. But like, you're right. You're absolutely right. The nonfiction just continues to go and go and go. And it's actually gotten more popular for me as well. It's kind of interesting because, you know, I like writing nonfiction, but honestly, in some ways I enjoy writing fiction more because it's like my little kid comes out. So it's a little frustrating in a way where it's like, oh, I put all my heart and effort into this fiction and my nonfiction sells because that's what the nonfiction people want, of course. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to write a ton of nonfiction because that's going to help, you know, bring in the money so that I can then do the fiction projects that I really want to do, which, you know, I'm going to have to like space out because I've at the same time got to recognize that I only have so much money.
Right. Well, and that not only that, but at the same time, well, and oh gosh, that can be terrible. I spent almost $1,000 in cover art last month. I got a lot of covers though for that kind of money. I was doing auctions and everything. But the great thing is like, especially with series, you'll notice like sometimes a series won't get popular until like the 3rd, 4th, or 5th book. It's like a sleeper hit. Like nobody realizes how good it is until they get into the 4th book or whatever, and then they start telling all their friends about it. And then you'll see like a boost. So I've seen that with my OTS series and my 13 Covens series, which are 2 of my Audrey Bryce titles. And there was a point where I actually did have some best-selling fiction. I was selling like 50,000 to 100,000 copies of an individual Anne O'Connell title there for a while, and that was back during the ebook boom, I guess they say, back in 2010, 2011. And the steamy stuff was doing really well, and then Amazon put it right behind the wall, and it just kind of like chopped the legs off of it. But there was a time where my fiction was actually carrying me, and the nonfiction was just kind of like a side love project. And for the most part, I mean, I still view the nonfiction as a side love project, even though right now it's probably doing better than fiction. Although Audrey Bryce is starting to go up there. So because I've been working on her consistently for the last year. So that's another thing. When you have 4 pen names, it's hard to pay attention to all of them.
Yeah. So speaking of that, you know, how do you schedule your writing? Because that is part of the issue. I mean, you have to write, you got to produce, and in your case, you've got 4 different pen names. You know, that's a lot. So what do you do to handle that?
So let's just say not real well at the moment. I'm still like learning my process and what schedule works for me. This year, I actually tried putting up pre-orders for the whole year and telling myself, okay, all of these have to get done. You're not allowed to push forward a single release. And so far I've done it. I have one more book to write before the end of the year and one to edit. But it just requires coming into the office, sitting down and getting to work. I sacrificed a lot of things though this year for that. I sacrificed deep cleaning my house once a month. I sacrificed a lot of family time and outside time. So I sacrificed a lot of things, and I don't think I like the pressure of a pre-order being there saying you have to meet this deadline, because there's a consequence, there's a punishment, because you know how Amazon, if you know, they'll cut you off from pre-orders for a year, and that's not a good thing either. I don't want to lose my pre-orders. So what I'm going to do is next year I'm going to use the first 6 months of the year to write ahead. And I've already kind of scheduled out, I'm doing for Anne, I'm doing a re-release of the Gilded Lily series, and those will come out next year. And that's just a reformat. I wanted to reformat, update the back matter, and re-release them with new titles and everything, maybe for a new audience. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm still going to tell my readers, you know, this was previously published as, you know, Training Amy or whatever, but I'm re-releasing for a new audience. It's been 10 years, so the audience has changed. So I think you do have to occasionally refresh your covers and all of that, because I mean, look at major publishers. How many covers have they had of Stephen King's The Shining, for example? And the reason they keep doing that is because they want to update it. So I mean, as like a business owner and a writer, you have to think about those things like perpetually, because this is your backlist, and that's what's going to like continue making you money as you write more books. And the best, I don't know, I've always been told the best advertising for your backlist is the next book. So because with each book you have a potential to win a new reader, and they're going to, if they like what they read, they're going to go to your backlist and say, what else has this person written? And then they're going to make their way through your backlist.
No, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
So that's why that's one of the reasons for the continual production. But also I think readers have an expectation now, and the very prolific writers have built an expectation for readers to get a minimum of 1 to 2 new releases a year, if not more. So but I'm working on it. So what I'm doing with my schedule for the next year is I'm going to be writing for 2 months, and then editing 1 month, and then writing 2 months, editing 1 month, and just continue doing that. And if I do that consistently, the first 6 months of the year, I should have all of my releases scheduled, done, uploaded, and scheduled for the next year.
Oh, wow.
From there. So that's my goal, is to write ahead to where I'm not chasing a deadline every month, where I already have stuff already scheduled out. So if something bad happens, like I end up in the hospital for an emergency surgery, or someone in my family needs help because they're sick or something, I don't have to worry about missing deadlines or losing my pre-order privileges. I've got it all done and already up. So there's other like really writers who do really well that do that, like Amanda Lee, who writes the Witchy Cozy Mysteries. She does that fantastically. She doesn't even put stuff up for pre-order until it's done. Yeah,
I feel you on the scheduling. I mean, I'm learning that myself in more ways than one. I mean, part of it's figuring out like the ideal schedule for writing, and part of it then is the scheduling for the books and everything else. And especially, I think a lot of times too, like with fiction in particular, you have different things you do marketing wise with fiction. I mean, you use promo sites, for example, as well as online advertising, whereas with nonfiction, it's basically just online advertising. There's no promo sites out there. So, I mean, I think that's another factor too, because if you want to use a site like Robbins Reads or whatever else, you've got to schedule it out far enough that you're able to get in there. And at the same time, it's in a short enough time that you still have to have the content ready to go.
Right. And not only that, but I mean, if you think about it, a lot of these things, I think the writer's most valuable tool though is like their newsletter, because those people have signed up to your newsletter specifically to hear from you, and they may not go to all those other websites. It's kind of like Facebook. Like, honestly, the only reason I use Facebook is to talk to my readers, but not all of them see all of my messages. I like to share articles with them and, memes and just silly stuff, but I like to have conversations with them too, kind of get to know them a little bit. So I don't really see like social media as much of a selling thing. It's not a place to sell. It's more to kind of get to know your audience. But then not all of your audience hangs out there. So you just have to hope that they click your Amazon follow, or they subscribe to your newsletter or your blog or whatever, and be consistent about all of that. Like I'll put up, if I know everything that's going to be released, I'll schedule up all my blog posts. I'll take a day out of, at the beginning of the year, schedule all the blog posts for release days, and those will automatically post.
Oh, wow.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, there's things that you can do. I actually had to hire somebody this year to do my social media. I can't do it anymore.
Well, I mean, there you go. That's a sign of success right there, because when you're able to kind of put everything together in that way, I think that that's really important. Now, speaking of that, I mean, for as long as I've known you, you've been doing the publishing and also that, but you've also worked at a job. So how do you balance, the responsibilities of working at a day job, for example, with writing and with your family time? Because of course you do have all those things going on.
I haven't worked a full-time job since 2011. So, I used to, I was still very, very much prolific while having a day job, like a full-time day job where I was working 60 hours a week. But I spent at least 2 hours a night, never fail, writing. And I think I was almost more disciplined back then because I didn't have a lot of time. So I had to make the most of the time I had. I was also in my 30s and I had a lot more energy. And life hadn't beaten me up so much. I mean, health-wise, as you get older, things you have to do. It's like you have to exercise as you get older. You just don't have a choice if you want your cholesterol to be right and your blood pressure and all of that. But whereas when you're younger, you can get away with not doing that kind of stuff. So
Yeah. I mean, I feel you on that one. I mean,
yeah, it's like,
I'm in my 40s and I'm like, all right, dude, you got to get up and do the Qigong exercises. You got to take care of yourself because nothing else is going to do it for you.
right. And like our job is so sedentary and you sit so much. And then of course, if you go to a day job and then sit for another, 10 hours or whatever, 8 to 10 hours, I mean, that's just really bad for you. Anyway, but I don't know. Honestly, I look back and I wonder to myself, how did I get so much written? And I think it's just because I was very consistent in coming home at night, and I had my computer set up right there on the kitchen island. So I wasn't like removed from the family. So everybody had access to me, the cats, the husband, whoever stopped by. And I could just sit there and write in there. And I actually wrote in the family room for years too. But then I got to a point, I really need an office because my writing mess, as you can see, my office is just a disaster. It was starting to spill out into the rest of the house, and the husband was kind of like, yeah, I don't think I like this too much. So that was always fun. But but when I went part-time, I only work Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and every other Tuesday. So I mean, I guess it's still kind of a full-time job, but it's like 32 hours a week, which is much more manageable and I can get a lot more done. But I got to a point where I just couldn't manage the social media anymore. So you pick and choose your battles. I'm like the sole income provider for my family right now. My husband has contract jobs and stuff like that on and off, but we just never know when he's going to be working or not. So it's easier to schedule now because I actually have dedicated writing days. Whereas sure. I didn't before. I just had to, and I used to work every other Saturday on top of that. So it was like 60 hours a week.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make because when I just finished working a full-time job recently, and when I was working there, I was writing in between phone calls and stuff like that. And so, and then in the evenings I'd come home, and like you said, it was in a sense easier to be more disciplined. Whereas now, and I've been settling into this new schedule with admittedly a bit of chaos, self-manufactured on my own end, but fortunately worked out. But I I've been figuring out my schedule, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, I even have specific days. Like I have my marketing day is Friday, for
Right.
example. So do you do anything like that as well with your scheduling, where you're kind of like, okay, I know I need to put out a newsletter or a blog. I mean, I know you mentioned
Um,
scheduling stuff, but
I tried doing like days and stuff like that. Like I use I use planners. I'm a planner girl. I've got planners of the yin yang, but I have one specifically for my publishing. And not only do I like kind of schedule out everything, I tried to do, and I find I just didn't stick with it. Like pages where I was like, okay, so these are the projects I'm going to work on. These are the days I'm going to do things. And it doesn't always pan out for me. So what I started doing is I still do write in like I've got a newsletter coming out Saturday, and but I have spreadsheets, and then I've got spreadsheets of like everything that's going into that newsletter, like all the promos, all the newsletter swaps, because I've got 3 releases this month, one for the publishing company, and then one's a cozy mystery, and one's a horror novel that I co-wrote with another author, and it's so there's just so much to coordinate that if I didn't write it down in like one place and have like one planner specifically for the publishing business, I would get lost. And there are times like during my breaks at the day job now, I will sit down and do stuff. But I've noticed like the more books you have, the more pen names you have, the more work you have. And it does get to a point where you're going to have to hire help, and that's just all there is to it.
I think that's a good point, that you kind of have to learn how to outsource and also change your business model as time goes on. Those first few books, yeah, that's easy to do. But
Right.
then as you write more and more books, you do have to start thinking like, okay, what resources do I need? How do I manage this?
Well, and when you start noticing also like things that you're doing that are working, then you have to do more of that thing, which means you have to spend more time scheduling that thing.
Yeah.
So,
Now, now, one thing that I think goes along with that is, I mean, and I think this is kind of an attitude that that is really important, is like, at the same time, you have to learn how to test things to figure out like what really does work. So within what you do as an indie author, for your business, how do you go about testing and figuring out like what works versus what doesn't work? What's your process or method for that?
whenever I find something, I tend to be one of those people who kind of dips my toes in first and then just jumps right in. So I'll try it, and if it doesn't really pan out, I'll go deeper. I'll like go do it even harder just to see. Just I'll give it a one-time push. Um, and I've found that well, it's kind of like book funnel promos. Those are like really big right now. They're going really good. They work better for some genres than others. It also depends on who's in your promo group and whether or not they're actually pulling their own weight and sending out their promos to the readers. Um, and sometimes you're limited by your audience with those things, but I'm worried that those are getting to be like their effectiveness is kind of wearing off. They're not as good as they were when they first started. But I am like one of those people who's willing to try something first, or I'll kind of like ask around my writing community, like, hey, have you tried this thing? What were your results with it? Um, and to be honest, like right now, I think between Amazon ads and the book funnel promos, that's where I'm getting my most traction. The book funnel promos for fiction,
Hmm.
advertising at the Amazon ads for nonfiction. With
That's
fiction, it helps too. It keeps like certain series in people's minds. Like I've seen sales of series that haven't been selling for a while, like my old Sorcerer's Twilight series, which is an S.J. Reisner title.
right.
That used to see sells all the time back in like 2010, 2012, but it's like it was a trickle ever since then. Like, I'd sell 3 copies a year of like the first book, and whether or not people went through to the rest of the books, it was anyone's guess. But since I started doing the advertising, the Amazon advertising, I've seen steady monthly sales. So of those books. So
Yeah, I agree with you about the book funnel. I mean, I do that too, and I mean, I do think it's effective, but at the same time, I am seeing a little bit of an interesting drop off as time goes on. So, I mean, I think there's also that point of market saturation where
right,
like a given marketing tactic
right,
starts to not work as well because people are kind of like, okay, been there, done that. Whereas whereas with some like online ads, I mean, you don't really have that per se, but then you have to figure out like what works or what doesn't work. I mean, I've dabbled with BookBub ads and
Mhm.
Facebook ads, and really what I found so far is that Amazon ads seem to work the best. So there's
Mhm.
always that, that factor of, and of course, I think that it makes sense. I mean, Amazon ads, why are people there anyway? They're there to buy.
Right.
So it makes sense. And Amazon has the entire site geared up in a very specific way in order to funnel people toward buying more than the product they initially came for. They're very smart that way. So it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, and I think that that's kind of where a lot of indie authors kind of have to figure out how to balance that business side with the writing side.
Right.
It's always important to be writing, but you also have to figure out, okay, well, where does the business balance that, so that way I can actually make money off of this instead of having it be an expensive hobby.
Well, and I think that's where a lot of writers get kind of tripped up with the indie stuff, is they are still thinking in a traditional publishing mindset, where traditionally, you spend a year writing a book, you spend a year promoting a book, and you can't do that when you are an indie and you're trying to make a career of it. You have to continue writing while you're promoting and continue producing at the same level while still promoting, and it can be hard, especially like with all the events. As much as I hate to say it, COVID has been kind of a blessing for my writing career this year, just because I haven't had to go to all those events. And because those can take, that's a lot more, you got to order your stock and make sure you have all your swag. And if you don't have swag, you got to update it and kind of, develop and build your new swag before you. And so there's just other things. I was able to use all my marketing money this year on covers and stuff like that, and on Amazon advertising instead. So that was nice. So I don't know, it
Yeah,
might
yeah,
keep
I
doing
mean,
that.
I hate to say it, but COVID was a blessing for me in one sense too. I mean, I don't like it, but the fact is, like, my publishing or the writing just kind of took off because more
Yeah.
people are reading. So yeah, that makes sense. You bring up an interesting point there too, which is, I mean, like, you go to these different shows and things like that, and you have to have swag. And again, I think, a lot of times authors don't necessarily even realize that, the idea of is the author just kind of writing at home and releasing a book or whatever. But, at the same time, there is, presumably one day we'll be going and doing these conventions again. So how important are those conventions? How important have those conventions been for your success, during non-pandemic times?
I think it depends on the convention. Like, surprisingly, there's a local literary convention for sci-fi fantasy that, as far as like book sales or anything, it's terrible. But because it tends to attract people who want to become writers. And while writers are readers, writers also have so many friends that are writers that they're going to read their friends' stuff before they start reading some author they don't know. So, and I think that's a big thing that a lot of indies do as a mistake, is they try to advertise to their writing groups,
Mm.
and they really don't know how to use social media. I really need to teach a class on that. But um, they're not looking beyond like the people they know. They're not looking out to the wider audience. But that's the thing, as an indie, is you have to attract that wider audience somehow. Like those people who will browse a Barnes and Noble bookshelf and pick something based on a cover and what it says on the back blurb and go, oh, that sounds really good. You have to be able to duplicate that on your own. And there are places you can go to hire help for this kind of stuff, but it's expensive. It's easier to learn how to do as much as you can. I think as an indie, you need to learn how to be adaptable. You need to be willing to learn new skills. And you also need to, because a lot of people become indies because they're control freaks. I'm guilty. That's one of the reasons I went in. Yeah, there you go. And then you have to learn how to let go when you finally get to a point where you just can't do it all. So there's just a lot of different things that I think you have to have the right personality and mindset to be an indie author. You have to be willing to explore and do research, especially when it comes to advertising, and talk to people. And you have to stay active in your writing communities, because that's where you learn a lot of the stuff. Like, you hear people start talking about this site or that site, it's probably in your best interest to go check it out. So,
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can't tell you how many books on writing and specifically the business of indie author writing that I've been reading this year. You know, I'm
mhm.
reading Amazon Decoded, the updated version by David Goggin right now, for example. And I was reading a book on rapid releasing, and I think a lot of indie authors don't realize, like, yeah, you really have to keep up with what is going on, and you need to understand exactly that. I mean, I actually was in traditional publishing for a while with a small press, but
Okay.
even there, you know, I kind of got lucky in that I ended up doing the layout, the editing, and the distribution. So I got to learn all the things that an indie author really does need to learn.
Mhm.
And then I was able to take that and meld that in. And that's why for me, like my nonfiction in particular just took off because I already knew that market really well. And I was able to take that plus some stuff that I learned about online marketing beforehand and apply it, and it's worked out really well. And I'm still figuring it out on the fiction end of things, of course, because that's a different market. And you know, up until recently, I hadn't published anything with fiction. I'd written it, but not published it. So I think, you know, there's also that aspect. Like if you're going to write multiple genres, you have to realize that what works for one genre will not automatically carry over for another.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the book funnels are tremendously more effective for cozy mysteries than so far any other genre that I've been working in. I don't know though. I'm testing some new stuff, but um, as far as like the most successful promos, it's the cozy mystery because that's kind of like the cozy mysteries. It also depends where you're writing too. Like you write, you're saying you write superhero novels. Those are kind of like an in thing right now. So I don't know. You're probably having, I don't know, are you having good success with those or?
I'm not. I mean, they're pretty good, but I think that the issue comes down to the covers. They look too much like graphic novel covers as opposed to what the superhero. Because I did like an analysis of it, and I'm like, when I look at the covers of other people who write in this, for the most part, they don't look like comic book covers, whereas mine does. So I'm like, all
Ah,
right, I need to, and that's a good example of where you need to make that change. Whereas when I look at like my zombie apocalypse stuff, it's the covers aren't exactly the same. And of course, you don't want the covers to be exactly the same as everyone else's, but they have to be similar enough. And it is
well,
similar
to where
enough.
the reader can look at it and go, oh, that's the kind of novel that's kind of like this other one that I liked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so like in that case, there's not that potential genre thing because graphic novels are even though they might be about superheroes, it's a distinctly different medium. So if somebody
Mhm.
thinks that they're getting a comic book instead of an actual book, they're going to be disappointed. And I think a lot of times that's what people don't realize. Like your covers really do tell a story in and of themselves, and the right covers make all the difference.
Right. Well, and that's one of the big things. Like indies just starting out today, unless they have like a degree in graphic arts and they can do a really good job mimicking other covers in their genre, they should not do their own covers. I see that so often, like really good books, like the content inside them is fantastic. The covers are horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not selling any books and they're like, why? Is it my writing? It's not your writing, it's your packaging. I mean, for the most part, I've read some books that sell like they're bestsellers on Amazon. They're like in the top 10 of whatever category they're in, maybe even like a big category like romance or something. And they're in the top 10. But it's because they have and it may not even be well written, but it's got nice packaging and the reader knows exactly what to expect based on the cover and the blurb. And I think, and that's one of the things that I find so frustrating because I work with indies a lot. I've done a lot of volunteer work with indie organizations in the past few years. And I think that is the most difficult thing is when you tell someone, you know, I think you need to change your covers. They're not quite, you'd be amazed at how many people get offended by that. And they just refuse to change their covers. They're like, oh, well, my friend, you know, did this cover. I have tried several covers on different series over the years to see kind of what if it would work or if it wouldn't. I've even done my own mock-ups and everything and then sent those to the cover artist to have them do some things because I'm not capable. Um, but I've found like I was trying to sell urban fantasy with more of a general contemporary fiction cover and that just didn't work. for that. I mean, it did for like my diehard readers and my super fans, but it didn't for the general populace. Now that they have like covers that scream urban fantasy, I'm bringing in those readers that just like urban fantasy, who've never even heard of me before.
Exactly. And I mean, that's what people look for. So you have to be willing to change that. I know, like in my case, what I'm doing is I'm saving some money up for those cover overhauls for the superhero for when I decide to write my next superhero fiction book. So
Yeah.
I'll just leave them as is for right now. But then when the time comes, I'm going to go ahead and get those covers overhauled when I have a new book out, and I'll have some money, I have some money stopped aside. I mean, I try to put, so much money aside each month toward the business savings, because the idea is if it's a bad month, I've got money to cover things.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a great month, well then, hey, great. Then I can put that toward other marketing things that I want to try, stuff like doing a cover overhaul.
Right.
You mentioned one thing about, how with traditional publishing, the authors will write a book and then market a book for a year. But one thing I have noticed recently, and I just think it's kind of interesting, is I'm starting to see like some of those authors doing like a hybrid model, or trying to do things a little bit more rapidly. Like Jim Butcher
Mm-hmm.
released basically a 2-part book. Peace Talks just came out, and then his next book in his occult, urban fiction thing is coming out at the end of this month or the beginning of the month. And then Bradley Boulot, also, who's written some interesting stuff. He's got these independent novellas that he's doing in between his books. So it's interesting, because you also do see some traditional writers are starting to realize, well, we've got to start trying to do stuff that the indie authors are doing.
Right.
And that's
Well, and
same. Oh, go
I
on.
think, I'm sorry, traditional publishing is having a hard time keeping up. They've lost a huge share of the market to the indies.
Yeah, they didn't expect that, but I mean, I think it's going to keep happening, not just because of the pandemic. That certainly is in its own way helping, but I think also just because traditional publishing just doesn't have as much to offer to authors. I mean, yes, you're an indie author, you have to learn more of the stuff, but the thrill of that is you're in control. You're doing the marketing, you're doing all the other work, and that's something that you're just not. Since you're kind of expected to do that anyway with traditional publishing, the question kind of comes down to, well, what do you guys have to offer me that I can't attend to on my own?
Mm-hmm. I mean, aside from the editing and cover art, and now that there's a market for it, you get quality editors and cover artists at a reasonable rate, you know. But that is the thing. You do have to have the money for it, which is, why when you start out, it's almost best to keep like a day job, or at least a part-time day job or whatever.
Right. And also have some kind of practice where you're actually saving some money aside each
Mm-hmm.
month. Like, initially you might not be able to do that. Like the first few months that I was doing stuff, all the money going in was going right back out, meeting
Yeah.
expenses. But once I started actually making some money, that's when I was like, all right, I'm going to take 100 out this month. I'm going to take 200. This month it was 1,000. It's like, okay, I'm going to take out a little bit each month, and I'm going to put it aside because I know that I need to have that in order to have those extra funds.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're coming to the end here, and so what I want to kind of do is just get any final thoughts from you about, what it takes to be successful in the indie author world out there, as well as any final advice you would want to give to someone who's aspiring to be an indie author, who maybe has published a few books but is not quite as far along. I mean, 200 pieces, that's pretty amazing, I have to say.
So I think first of all, I think it takes a special type of person to be successful as an indie. First of all, you have to be a self-starter, because there's nobody to tell you to stop binge watching Netflix and go get to work. You have to be able to do that on your own. So you have to have incredible willpower, and you really have to want it. Um, it's always best if you have someone to support you when you first start out, or a day job, because being an indie author, you have to, it is expensive in the very beginning. And if you want to do it right, and you want to uh, have any hope of like putting your name on the map, so to speak. I also think that people need to, I think they really need to look at it realistically, because you have to do all your own paperwork. You have to stay organized. You have to be able to produce at a pretty decent rate. If you can only write one book a year, indie may not be for you. I mean, as far as like trying to make a career out of it. It's okay to be a hobby writer and be an independently published author. There's no problem with that. But if you actually want to make a career out of it, there are certain skills and personality types that just do better at it. And that's one of the things I do want to bring up. So when people are thinking about it seriously, before just quitting their day job and throwing caution to the wind, really consider, are you the type of, do you have the personality type to run your own business and to be motivated? Because there's nobody going to do it for you. And selling fiction is really hard, especially because that's like a splurge purchase for most people. And more people read nonfiction than they do fiction. You have to be able to diversify. You have to be able to adapt. And you also have to know how to budget your money, because you're at that point, you only get paid once a month. So you got to take that money and make it last the entire month. So
that, or find alternate means of income. I mean, I have classes I teach, so I get, every Thursday some money rolls in for that, but still, even then,
right.
That's not a lot. So it's at the end of the month that, I get my paycheck, so to speak. You're exactly right. Now, all those points are great. And I mean, I think that really hits home that, this is really, you do have to have the right discipline. I mean, you have to be willing to get up and write every day that you're going to write. I mean, if you're not going to write on the weekends, for example, that's fine. You can do that. I mean, I've taken to not writing on the weekends, which has actually helped me be more productive. But you have to then be able to sit down and write and get the work done, and at the same time do all the other things. And as you said earlier, at some point you have to learn when to let go and hire other people. So, I mean, everything you're saying here really hits home. And I mean, certainly for me as as a moderately successful indie author at this point, it also gives me an idea as to like the horizons that I need to be looking toward down the line, because you're definitely where I want to be is at some point down the line here.
Well, that's good, I guess. I mean, yeah, I'd like to be further along. And trust me, I know people who are more prolific and doing much better than I am. So there's always like that next horizon to get to, the next mountain to climb.
Well, there is. And I mean, the wonderful thing, though, is that, you have wonderful people like yourself that you can, I mean, I feel fortunate to be able to talk with you. You and I've talked a few times on Messenger and things like that. And, I'm so grateful to you for being on this first podcast. But also you're just a genuinely awesome and amazing person. And I feel blessed to have you as a friend.
Well, thank you. I feel the same way.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you go here. Thank you for coming on to the show, and to all of those out there, thanks for watching.